I stared at the group photo from last weekend's company picnic, my stomach dropping as I scrolled through the images on the company website. There was the entire leadership team of Meridian Tech Solutions, all smiles around the barbecue pit. There was the executive committee posing by the lake, and there was the team celebration shot that would grace next quarter's investor presentation. I was in none of them. Despite being listed as senior strategic consultant on every project for the past 2 years, I had somehow become invisible when the cameras came out. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just another employee they could sideline. I was Emma Sullivan, and I owned 45% of the company they thought they were running without me. This was the moment I decided to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Sullivan, and this is the story of how I taught a room full of executives that respect isn't optional when you hold the power to make or break their careers. 2 years ago, when my former mentor Robert Chen approached me about starting a cybersecurity firm, I saw an opportunity that extended far beyond a simple business investment. Robert had the technical expertise and industry connections, but he needed capital and strategic vision to transform his innovative security protocols into a viable company. I had recently inherited $2.3 million from my grandmother's estate, money that represented generations of careful saving and wise investments. Rather than letting it sit in traditional portfolios, I decided to bet on something I believed in. But I also made a calculated decision to structure my involvement as a silent partnership. On paper, I would appear as a senior consultant, while actually owning nearly half the company through carefully crafted legal agreements that kept my true stake confidential. The decision wasn't driven by modesty or a desire to avoid attention. I wanted to observe how the company developed its culture, how leadership emerged naturally, and how decisions were made when people thought no one was watching who really mattered. What I discovered over 2 years was both enlightening and deeply troubling. Meridian Tech Solutions operated out of a sleek downtown Denver office building, the kind of glass and steel structure that suggested innovation and success to potential clients. Robert had assembled what appeared to be a strong leadership team. David Kim, our chief operating officer, brought an MBA from Northwestern and 5 years of experience at a major consulting firm. Jennifer Walsh, our vice president of operations, had spent a decade managing client relationships at a Fortune 500 company. Mark Rodriguez, our newest addition as vice president of business development, had joined us 6 months ago with an impressive track record of landing enterprise-level contracts. On the surface, they seemed like exactly the kind of team that could scale a cybersecurity startup into a major player. They spoke the right corporate language, understood client expectations, and projected the professional confidence that enterprises look for when selecting security partners. The problem was that their professional polish came with an underlying assumption about who belonged in leadership conversations and who didn't. The exclusion started subtly, as these things usually do. During our first major client presentation to Morrison Industries, David had introduced our team to the prospective client's IT director. He'd gestured toward himself, Jennifer, and Mark as he explained our collaborative approach and leadership structure. When I stepped forward to discuss the technical aspects of our security framework, something I'd spent months developing, David smoothly redirected the conversation. Emma handles a lot of our detailed implementation work, he'd said with a smile that somehow managed to be both appreciative and dismissive. But for strategic overview, you'll primarily be working with our executive team. The client had nodded and focused their questions on David, despite the fact that I was the one who designed the very protocols they were interested in implementing. After we'd won the contract, a 6-figure deal that represented a significant milestone for our young company, David had organized a celebration dinner for what he called the core leadership team. My invitation had somehow gotten lost in email. These incidents might have been easy to dismiss individually, but they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. When Inc. magazine reached out about featuring our innovative approach to enterprise cybersecurity, somehow only the core leadership was available for interviews. When industry conferences invited speakers from our company, my name never seemed to make it onto the submission lists, despite my deep expertise in the technical aspects that set us apart from competitors. The company picnic last Saturday had crystallized everything that had been building for months. Meridian Tech had rented space at Cherry Creek State Park, complete with catered barbecue, team building activities, and professional photography to capture our company culture for marketing materials. I'd arrived early to help with setup, as I always did, bringing homemade desserts and coordinating with the catering staff to ensure everything ran smoothly. As employees and their families began arriving, I noticed the subtle social dynamics that had developed within our company. David, Jennifer, and Mark naturally clustered together with their spouses, discussing weekend plans at exclusive restaurants and sharing stories about their children's activities at the same private schools. They'd created an inner circle that extended beyond work hours, reinforcing their professional bonds through social connections that somehow never included me. When the photographer arrived and began organizing group shots, the exclusion became visually obvious. David had taken charge of coordinating the photos, gathering what he called the management team for the first round of pictures. As I approached the group, Jennifer had intercepted me with that practiced corporate smile I'd come to recognize. "Emma, would you mind helping coordinate the food service while we handle the official photography? We really need someone to manage the logistics and make sure everyone gets fed." The request was framed as if I were doing them a favor, taking on an important responsibility that required my particular skills. But the underlying message was unmistakable. While they positioned themselves for photos that would represent our company leadership to clients, investors, and industry publications, I was being relegated to serving potato salad and managing paper plates. I'd spent the next hour watching from the food stations as they captured image after image of our leadership team. David commanding attention at the center of every shot, Jennifer positioned as the polished professional who bridged technical expertise with client relations, Mark representing our aggressive growth strategy and business development success. They looked like exactly what investors wanted to see: a cohesive, professional team with clear hierarchies and defined roles. The irony burned deeper with each camera flash. Without my initial investment, none of them would have had jobs to exclude me from. The security protocols they were discussing in investor meetings? I'd developed the foundational concepts during late nights in my home office, drawing on graduate work in cybersecurity and years of consulting experience across multiple industries. The client relationships they were celebrating? I'd spent months building trust with technical teams and understanding their specific security challenges before any contracts were signed. Yet somehow, in the span of 2 years, I'd been transformed from co-founder and major stakeholder into the person who managed catering logistics, while others represented the vision I'd helped create. The weekend passed with me reviewing every interaction, every decision, every moment where I'd accepted treatment that didn't match my actual role in the company. I'd told myself that being behind the scenes was strategic, that observing without interference would give me valuable insights into organizational dynamics. But I was beginning to realize that my silence had been interpreted as acceptance of a lesser role. Monday morning brought a leadership meeting that would prove to be a turning point. I'd been included in the calendar invite, though I suspected it was more out of habit than intention. The conference room overlooked downtown Denver's skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows providing a backdrop that suggested ambitious vision and unlimited potential. David had connected his laptop to the large display monitor and was cycling through photos from the company picnic. "These shots really capture our team culture," he was saying, clicking through images where I was conspicuously absent. The photographer did an excellent job showing our cohesive leadership approach. Investors respond well to seeing a unified team with clear structure. Jennifer leaned forward, studying the images with professional appreciation. "Exactly what we need for the quarterly presentation. It demonstrates that we've evolved past startup chaos into a mature organization with defined roles and accountability." Mark, who'd been taking notes on his tablet, looked up with enthusiasm. "Should we update our website team page to reflect this organizational clarity? Maybe restructure the staff listings to better show our leadership hierarchy?" The casual way they discussed reorganizing my position in company materials while I sat directly across from them felt like watching someone plan your own professional funeral. They weren't even attempting to be subtle about their intentions to marginalize my role in company leadership. I cleared my throat deliberately. "I'm sitting right here." The room fell into uncomfortable silence. David had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, though his discomfort seemed more about being caught than about the underlying sentiment. "Emma, of course we value your contributions. This is just about presenting a clear organizational structure to external stakeholders." A structure where the person who developed our core security architecture isn't considered part of leadership? Jennifer jumped in smoothly, her corporate training evident in every practiced phrase. Your technical expertise is absolutely essential to our success, Emma. We're talking about streamlining our external messaging to avoid confusion about reporting structures and decision-making authority. The word streamlining hung in the air like a euphemism for erasure. I could feel my patience reaching its limit as I watched them attempt to justify systematic exclusion with corporate buzzwords and strategic positioning arguments. Mark, apparently oblivious to the growing tension, added his own perspective with characteristic bluntness. Plus, having too many people in leadership photos can look disorganized from an investor standpoint. Clean hierarchy sells better than collaborative complexity. In that moment, sitting in that glass conference room with the Denver skyline stretching beyond the windows, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of the situation. They weren't just excluding me from photos and meetings because of oversight or poor communication. They were actively working to redefine my role in the company, and they expected me to accept their revision of reality without question. That evening, I drove home to my apartment in the Highlands neighborhood, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd witnessed. The 30-minute commute gave me time to process the full scope of what had been happening and what needed to change. I'd spent 2 years trying to be the ideal team player, supporting their leadership development while keeping my ownership stake private. But my restraint had been interpreted as weakness, and my strategic patience had been mistaken for acceptance of a subordinate role. I pulled into my parking space and sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the mountain views that had drawn me to Denver in the first place. The Front Range stretched across the horizon, peaks that had withstood geological pressures far greater than corporate politics. I needed to find that same kind of resilience and stop allowing others to define my position in a company I'd helped build from nothing. Inside my apartment, I made a cup of tea and settled into my home office, the same space where I'd originally developed the security protocols that had become Meridian Tech's flagship offering. The walls were lined with cybersecurity textbooks, industry publications, and framed certificates from technical conferences where I had presented research that was now generating revenue for people who acted like I was their subordinate. I pulled out the original partnership documents that Patricia Wong, my attorney, had crafted when Robert and I first structured the company. The legal language was precise and comprehensive, establishing my 45% ownership stake and outlining decision-making authority that extended far beyond what the current management team understood. As I reviewed each clause and provision, the full extent of my position became clear. Any major company decisions, including leadership restructuring, investor presentations, strategic direction changes, and organizational modifications. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Required approval from partners holding more than 40% of company ownership. The management team had been making decisions for 2 years, assuming Robert had full control, completely unaware that virtually every significant choice they'd implemented had technically required my consent. The irony was staggering. While they'd been systematically excluding me from leadership recognition, they'd been operating under governance structures that actually gave me more control over company direction than anyone except Robert himself. They'd been so focused on managing perceptions and establishing hierarchy that they'd forgotten to understand the actual power dynamics of the organization they thought they were running. I spent the rest of the evening researching my options and considering the best approach to address what had become an untenable situation. Patricia had outlined several potential paths when we'd originally structured the partnership, including mechanisms for resolving disputes, clarifying authority, and even dissolving the arrangement if fundamental disagreements arose about company direction. But before taking any formal action, I wanted to understand exactly how far the exclusion extended, and whether the pattern was as systematic as it appeared. I pulled up our company's client communications, investor materials, and public presentations from the past year, documenting every instance where leadership was represented or discussed. The evidence was overwhelming and depressing. Press releases quoted David, Jennifer, and Mark extensively, while mentioning me only in passing, if at all. Client testimonials featured their insights and expertise, while minimizing my role in developing the solutions clients were praising. Industry publications had interviewed our management team multiple times, without ever including the person who'd created the technical innovations they were discussing. Most telling were the investor updates Robert sent to our small group of external stakeholders. While the financial information was accurate and comprehensive, the narrative sections consistently highlighted management team achievements, while treating my contributions as operational support rather than strategic leadership. Even Robert, who knew exactly what I'd invested and contributed, had fallen into the pattern of presenting David, Jennifer, and Mark as the driving force behind our success. By midnight, I'd compiled a comprehensive analysis of how my role had been systematically minimized across every aspect of our external communications. The documentation would be essential for any formal discussions about correcting the record, but more importantly, it had clarified my own thinking about what needed to change and how quickly. Tuesday morning, I called Patricia Wong's office and scheduled an urgent consultation for that afternoon. Patricia had been my attorney for 5 years, handling everything from my grandmother's estate to various business investments, and she understood both my financial situation and my professional goals better than anyone. Her office occupied the top floor of a historic building in downtown Denver's legal district, with views of the state capitol and mountain backdrop that reminded clients they were dealing with someone who understood both local dynamics and broader perspectives. Patricia had built her practice representing entrepreneurs and investors who needed sophisticated legal strategies without the overhead of massive corporate firms. "Emma," she said as I settled into the leather chair across from her mahogany desk, "when you called about Meridian Tech governance issues, I pulled your original partnership file. Remind me what's been happening that's got you concerned about your position in the company." I walked her through everything systematically. The exclusion from leadership photos and presentations, the systematic minimizing of my role in client communications, the casual discussions about restructuring my position without consultation, and the growing pattern of decisions being made without recognizing my ownership stake or seeking my input on matters that legally required partner approval. Patricia took notes throughout my explanation, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific incidents or requesting details about how particular decisions had been communicated. Her expression grew increasingly serious as the scope of the situation became clear. "Emma, I need to be direct with you about something," she said after I'd finished my account. "As a 45% owner of Meridian Tech, you have significant governance rights that extend far beyond what they've been treating you as having. Every organizational restructuring they've discussed, every investor presentation they've made, every strategic decision they've implemented, has technically required your approval under the operating agreement we established." The implications were staggering. "You're saying they've been operating outside the legal governance structure for 2 years? I'm saying they've been making decisions without understanding the decision-making authority actually established in your partnership documents. Whether that's due to ignorance or deliberate oversight, the result is the same. They've been treating you as an employee subject to management authority when you're actually a partner with substantial control over company operations." Patricia opened my file and spread the original partnership agreement across her desk, pointing to specific clauses that outlined partner rights and responsibilities. The language was clear and comprehensive, establishing authority structures that bore no resemblance to how the company had been operating. "What are my options for addressing this?" I asked. "Several," she replied, pulling out a legal pad to outline possibilities. "You can demand immediate recognition of your governance rights and retroactive approval of all major decisions made without proper consultation. You can force a restructuring of company operations to reflect actual ownership stakes and decision-making authority. You can initiate dissolution proceedings if you determine the partnership isn't functioning according to its established terms. Or you can explore buyout options that would allow you to exit while recovering your investment plus appropriate returns." Each option carried different implications for my relationship with Robert, my financial future, and my professional goals. But they all started with the same first step: formal notification that I was invoking my partner rights and demanding immediate compliance with the governance structure we'd legally established. "Patricia," I said after considering the alternatives, "I want to start with formal notification of my governance rights and request for immediate compliance with our operating agreement. If they're willing to acknowledge reality and operate according to the actual partnership structure, we can avoid more drastic measures." She nodded approvingly. "That's the most professional approach, and it gives them an opportunity to address the situation before we escalate to more formal remedies. I'll draft a letter that outlines your ownership stake, governance rights, and expectations for immediate compliance with partnership obligations. We spent the next hour crafting language that was legally precise but not unnecessarily aggressive, establishing my position without creating unnecessary antagonism that might complicate future working relationships. The letter would go to the company's board of directors, which consisted of Robert, David, and Jennifer, formally notifying them of governance requirements they'd been ignoring and requesting immediate compliance. As I drove back to the office that afternoon, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing for months. For too long, I'd been accepting treatment that didn't match my actual position in the company, hoping that patience and professionalism would eventually lead to appropriate recognition. But some situations require direct action rather than diplomatic patience, and this had clearly become one of them. The next morning, Patricia's letter was delivered to Meridian Tech's board of directors via certified mail, with copies sent to our company's registered address and each board member's individual business addresses. The language was professional but unmistakable, formally invoking partner rights that had been established from the company's founding but never properly recognized in day-to-day operations. The response was immediate and dramatic. Robert called my cell phone within 2 hours of the letter's delivery, his voice tight with stress and confusion that suggested he hadn't fully understood the implications of our original partnership structure. "Emma, what's going on? David just forwarded me this legal letter about partner approval rights and governance compliance. I thought we were all working together effectively. Is there something specific that's been bothering you that we should discuss?" The question revealed how completely he'd missed the systematic exclusion that had been happening right in front of him. As the managing partner and technical visionary, Robert had been focused on product development and client satisfaction, while leaving organizational culture and internal dynamics to David and Jennifer. He genuinely seemed surprised that there were problems with how I'd been treated within the company leadership structure. "Robert," I said carefully, "when was the last time I was included in a leadership photo, quoted in a press release, or invited to represent our company at an industry event?" A long pause followed as he apparently tried to recall specific instances. I hadn't really thought about it that way. David and Jennifer usually handle the external communications and event coordination. I assumed you were involved in those decisions." "I haven't been. For 2 years, I've been systematically excluded from leadership recognition, while watching other people represent work I developed and strategies I created. Yesterday's leadership meeting was the final straw when they started discussing restructuring my role in company materials without even consulting me. Emma, I had no idea this was happening. David never mentioned any issues with team coordination or communication problems. His genuine surprise was both reassuring and frustrating. Reassuring because it suggested the exclusion wasn't something he'd approved or encouraged, but frustrating because it meant he'd been completely oblivious to dynamics that had been obvious to everyone else in the company, including junior staff members who'd started asking questions about organizational structure. "The legal letter outlines my governance rights as a 45% owner," I continued. "Rights that require my approval for major company decisions and recognition as a partner rather than an employee. We need to discuss how to move forward in a way that reflects the actual ownership structure rather than the hierarchy that's been assumed." Robert's response revealed how much the situation had caught him off guard. "Of course, absolutely. Let me talk to David and Jennifer about setting up a meeting to address this properly. I want to make sure we handle this right and figure out how to move forward as a team." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Robert asking questions about specific incidents and expressing genuine concern about how the situation had developed without his awareness. By the end of the call, we'd agreed to schedule a comprehensive leadership meeting for Friday afternoon, giving everyone time to review the partnership documents and prepare for substantive discussion about organizational structure and governance. Thursday brought a flurry of activity as the management team clearly scrambled to understand the legal and business implications of my formal notification. David requested copies of the original partnership agreement, something he apparently should have reviewed 2 years earlier when he'd joined the company. Jennifer scheduled a call with our corporate attorney to discuss governance requirements and partner obligations. Mark, who'd joined the company most recently, seemed completely bewildered by the revelations about ownership structure and decision-making authority. The most telling response came in a carefully worded email from David, clearly crafted with legal consultation, expressing the management team's commitment to proper governance and their desire to address any communication issues that might have contributed to misunderstandings about roles and authority. The corporate language couldn't quite disguise the panic underneath, as they began to realize how much they'd been operating outside the established legal framework. Friday's meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock in our main conference room, the same space where I'd been excluded from leadership discussions just days earlier. This time, however, the dynamic would be fundamentally different. Instead of watching others make decisions about my role in company materials, I would be asserting my actual authority over company operations and demanding compliance with governance structures that had been in place since our founding. As I prepared for what would undoubtedly be a difficult but necessary conversation, I reflected on how completely the situation had shifted in just 1 week. The company picnic photos that had initially seemed like a minor slight had revealed a systematic pattern of exclusion that violated both professional courtesy and legal governance requirements. Sometimes it takes a moment of clarity to recognize that patience has become enablement, and that professional courtesy has been mistaken for weakness. The weekend had given everyone time to review partnership documents and consider the implications of operating according to actual ownership stakes rather than assumed hierarchies. Monday would bring either genuine recognition of my position in the company or formal escalation of governance disputes that could fundamentally reshape Meridian Tech's future. Either way, the days of being excluded from leadership recognition while others represented my work were definitively over. Friday's meeting began with an uncomfortable energy that filled the conference room like static electricity before a storm. I arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio containing printed copies of our partnership agreement, governance documentation, and a timeline of incidents that had led to this confrontation. The others were already seated around the polished conference table, their posture and expressions revealing various degrees of anxiety about what was about to unfold. Robert sat at his usual position at the head of the table, looking more haggard than I'd seen him in months. The stress of the past week had clearly taken its toll, and I could see him struggling to reconcile his technical focus with the management failures that had created this crisis. David occupied his customary seat to Robert's right, his MBA training evident in the neat stack of documents he'd prepared, though his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something approaching wariness. Jennifer sat across from David, her corporate polish intact, but her eyes showing the kind of calculation that suggested she was already planning damage control strategies. Mark, positioned at the far end of the table, looked like someone who'd wandered into a meeting above his pay grade and wasn't quite sure how he'd gotten there. The partnership revelations had clearly blindsided him more than the others, since he'd joined the company assuming the organizational structure he'd observed was the actual legal reality. I took my seat directly across from Robert, a positioning choice that was both symbolic and practical. For 2 years, I'd accepted peripheral seating that reinforced my perceived role as a senior consultant rather than a company owner. Today, I was claiming physical space that reflected my actual authority in company decisions. Thank you all for making time for this discussion, I began, opening my portfolio and spreading documents across the table in front of me. I think we all understand why we're here, but I want to ensure we're operating from the same factual foundation before we discuss how to move forward. Robert cleared his throat nervously. Emma, I want to start by saying that if there have been communication problems or misunderstandings about your role in company leadership, we're committed to addressing them. David and Jennifer have briefed me on some of the concerns you've raised, and we want to find solutions that work for everyone. The word misunderstandings immediately set my teeth on edge. We weren't dealing with communication failures or role confusion. We were dealing with systematic exclusion that had violated both professional courtesy and legal governance requirements. The attempt to frame this as a misunderstanding suggested they still didn't grasp the seriousness of what had been happening. Robert, I said, keeping my voice level but firm, I appreciate your intention to address the situation, but I need to be clear about what we're actually discussing. This isn't about communication problems or role misunderstandings. This is about compliance with the legal governance structure we established when we founded this company. I pulled out the original partnership agreement and placed it in the center of the table where everyone could see it. According to this document, which we all signed 2 years ago, I hold 45% ownership of Meridian Tech Solutions. That ownership stake comes with specific governance rights, including approval authority over major company decisions, strategic direction changes, and external representations of company leadership. David leaned forward, his corporate training evident in his attempt to maintain professional composure despite obvious discomfort. Emma, I think we all recognize your significant investment in the company and value your contributions to our success. Perhaps we can discuss ways to better acknowledge your partnership role while maintaining operational efficiency. The phrase operational efficiency was clearly code for preserving the hierarchy they'd created, one where my ownership stake would be acknowledged in theory while being ignored in practice. I could see Jennifer nodding slightly at David's approach, suggesting they'd coordinated their response strategy before the meeting. David, I replied, I'm not looking for better acknowledgement of my partnership role. I'm demanding compliance with the legal obligations that partnership role entails. Every organizational decision you've made, every investor presentation you've delivered, every strategic pivot you've implemented has required my approval according to our operating agreement. That hasn't been happening. Mark, who'd been quietly reviewing his own copy of the partnership documents, looked up with genuine confusion. I'm sorry, but I'm having trouble understanding how this governance structure was supposed to work. When I joined 6 months ago, David was introduced as my direct supervisor, and Jennifer handled all the strategic coordination. Nobody mentioned partner approval requirements for business development decisions. His comment revealed the depth of the problem. Not only had the existing management team been operating outside our legal framework, but they'd been hiring and structuring new positions without any reference to actual company governance. Mark had been brought into a completely fictional organizational chart that bore no resemblance to our established authority structures. Mark, I said, that's exactly the issue we're addressing. The organizational structure you were introduced to doesn't match the legal ownership and governance arrangements that actually govern this company. Decisions about your role, your reporting relationships, and your strategic responsibilities should have involved partner consultation. Jennifer finally spoke, her tone carefully modulated to suggest reasoned professionalism. Emma, I think we can all agree that the company has grown and evolved since our founding, and perhaps our operational procedures haven't kept pace with the formal governance requirements. We're certainly willing to adjust our processes to ensure proper partner consultation moving forward. The diplomatic language was impressive, but it completely sidestepped the fundamental issue of accountability for 2 years of governance violations. They were treating this like a procedural adjustment rather than a serious breach of fiduciary obligations that had systematically undermined my position in the company I'd helped create. Jennifer, I responded, adjusting our processes moving forward isn't sufficient. We need to address the pattern of decisions that have been made without proper authorization and the systematic exclusion from leadership recognition that's resulted from operating outside our established governance framework. Robert, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, attempted to broker a middle ground. Emma, what specifically would you like to see happen to address the past issues while ensuring we operate correctly going forward? The question was reasonable, but it revealed that he still didn't understand the scope of what needed to change. This wasn't about making minor adjustments to improve future collaboration. This was about fundamentally restructuring how the company operated to reflect actual ownership stakes and legal obligations. I pulled out a second document from my portfolio, a detailed timeline I'd prepared, documenting specific incidents of exclusion and unauthorized decision-making. Robert, I've compiled a comprehensive record of governance violations over the past 2 years. Press releases that quoted management team members without including the partner who developed the innovations being discussed. Investor presentations that represented strategic direction changes without partner approval. Industry conferences where company representatives were selected without consulting ownership stakeholders. As I walked through the timeline, reading specific examples and dates, the room grew increasingly quiet. David's confident posture gradually deflated as the full scope of the documentation became apparent. Jennifer's strategic calculation shifted toward damage assessment as she realized how thoroughly I'd recorded their pattern of exclusion. Mark looked increasingly uncomfortable as he understood how his own hiring and positioning had been part of unauthorized organizational decisions. Furthermore, I continued, our client communications have consistently presented a management hierarchy that doesn't reflect actual company ownership or decision-making authority. Morrison Industries, our largest client, believes they're working with a management team that has full authority over strategic decisions, when in fact major contract modifications and service expansions require partner approval that hasn't been sought. Robert's face had gone pale as the implications became clear. Emma, are you saying our client contracts might not be properly authorized? I'm saying that contract modifications, service level changes, and strategic pivots have been implemented without following the governance procedures required by our partnership agreement. Whether those decisions are legally binding or need retroactive partner approval is something we should probably discuss with our attorney. The mention of potential legal complications sent a visible shock through the room. David began frantically taking notes, apparently calculating the implications for deals he'd been managing independently. Jennifer's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly as she considered how many operational decisions might require retroactive review. Mark looked like he was beginning to question whether he'd joined a legitimate company or walked into a legal nightmare. What do you want from us, Emma? David asked, his corporate diplomacy finally giving way to direct concern. What would it take to resolve this situation and move forward productively? The question was crucial because it revealed whether they were genuinely prepared to operate according to our established partnership structure, or were simply looking for ways to minimize the disruption to their preferred hierarchy. My response would determine whether we could find a path toward legitimate collaboration or would need to pursue more formal remedies. I want compliance with our operating agreement, I said simply. I want recognition as a 45% owner with appropriate governance rights and decision-making authority. I want my role in company development and strategic innovation to be accurately represented in all external communications. And I want assurance that future decisions will follow proper partner consultation procedures. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, clearly calculating the implications of what I was requesting. Emma, I understand your concerns about governance compliance, but I'm worried about the practical impact on our operational efficiency and client relationships. If every decision requires partner consultation, it could significantly slow our response times and complicate our management structure. Her objection was predictable, but revealed the core attitude that had created this problem. She was still thinking about my governance rights as an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a legal obligation to be respected. The operational efficiency she was concerned about had been achieved by ignoring the actual ownership structure of the company. Jennifer, I replied, our operating agreement already defines which decisions require partner consultation and which fall under day-to-day management authority. The issue isn't that proper governance is inefficient. The issue is that you've been making partner-level decisions without recognizing them as such. Robert attempted to regain control of the conversation by focusing on specific next steps. Emma, if we commit to following proper governance procedures moving forward, and work to address the representation issues you've identified, would you be willing to continue as part of the leadership team? The question contained an assumption that revealed how much he still didn't understand. He was asking if I'd be willing to continue as part of the leadership team, when in fact I was already a controlling partner who'd been excluded from leadership recognition. The framing suggested he still viewed my participation as something to be negotiated, rather than a right to be respected. Robert, I said, I'm not asking to continue as part of the leadership team. I'm demanding recognition as a company owner with legal governance rights that have been consistently violated. The question isn't whether I'm willing to participate in leadership. The question is whether this management team is prepared to operate according to the actual ownership structure of this company. The distinction was crucial, and the silence that followed suggested it was finally beginning to penetrate. David stopped taking notes and stared at the partnership documents spread across the table. Jennifer's strategic calculation shifted toward recognizing that they were negotiating from a position of legal weakness rather than operational strength. Mark looked like he was reassessing everything he'd thought he understood about company hierarchy and decision-making authority. What does that look like practically? David asked after a long pause. If we're operating according to actual ownership stakes, how do day-to-day decisions get made? How do we present company leadership to clients and investors? How do we structure management responsibilities? His questions were reasonable and suggested he was finally grappling with the reality of having operated outside proper governance for 2 years. But they also revealed the depth of restructuring that would be required to bring company operations into compliance with our legal framework. David, I replied, those are exactly the kinds of operational questions that should have been addressed 2 years ago when you joined the company. The partnership agreement outlines decision-making procedures, but they've never been implemented because management assumed they could operate independently of ownership oversight. I pulled out another document from my portfolio, a proposed organizational chart that reflected actual ownership stakes and governance rights. This is how company structure should look based on our legal agreements. Partner-level decisions require consultation between Robert and me as the controlling stakeholders. Management-level decisions can be made independently within established parameters. Strategic communications and external representations should reflect actual ownership and authority structures. The organizational chart was dramatically different from how they'd been operating. Instead of David, Jennifer, and Mark functioning as an autonomous management team, they would be accountable to partner oversight for major decisions. Instead of presenting themselves as company leaders to external stakeholders, they would be representing decisions made by the actual ownership team. Jennifer studied the proposed structure with obvious displeasure. Emma, this would significantly change how we've been positioning ourselves with clients and in industry relationships. Our credibility with external stakeholders is based on the leadership roles we've established over the past 2 years. Her concern about credibility was interesting because it revealed how much their professional reputations had become dependent on misrepresenting company authority structures. They'd built their industry positioning on presenting themselves as company leaders, when they were actually employees operating without proper oversight. Jennifer, I said, any credibility you've established with external stakeholders is based on misrepresenting our company's ownership and decision-making structure. If your professional reputation depends on continuing that misrepresentation, we have a fundamental problem that goes beyond governance compliance. Mark, who'd been quietly processing the implications of everything he'd heard, finally spoke up. I think I need to understand something basic. When I was hired, I was told I'd be reporting to David and working with Jennifer on strategic development. If that reporting structure doesn't actually exist, what exactly is my role in this company? His question highlighted one of the most problematic aspects of the situation. Not only had unauthorized decisions been made about organizational structure and external representation, but personnel had been hired and positioned based on a fictional hierarchy that violated our governance agreements. Mark, I replied, your role in the company should have been defined through proper partner consultation and approved according to our operating procedures. The fact that it wasn't means we need to review and potentially restructure positions that were created without appropriate authorization. The implications were staggering. 2 years of hiring decisions, organizational development, and strategic positioning had been based on operating assumptions that violated our legal framework. Bringing the company into compliance would require comprehensive review of personnel decisions, reporting structures, and authority relationships. Robert, who'd been growing increasingly agitated as the scope of required changes became apparent, finally lost his composure. Emma, I understand that we haven't been following proper procedures, but we've built a successful company with strong client relationships and solid revenue growth. Are you really suggesting we need to restructure everything we've accomplished because of governance technicalities? The word technicalities revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood what we were discussing. These weren't minor procedural oversights that could be dismissed as administrative details. These were systematic violations of the legal agreements that governed our partnership and defined our business relationship. Robert, I said, my patience finally reaching its limit, these aren't governance technicalities. These are the fundamental legal obligations that define how our company operates and who has authority to make decisions. You can't build a successful company by ignoring the ownership structure that makes that company possible. The meeting had reached a crucial inflection point. Either they would recognize the seriousness of the governance violations and commit to comprehensive compliance with our operating agreement, or we would need to pursue formal remedies that could fundamentally alter the company's future. The choice was theirs. But the days of operating outside our legal framework were definitively over. David, apparently recognizing the gravity of the situation, made one final attempt at finding middle ground. Emma, what if we commit to proper governance moving forward and work to gradually adjust our external positioning to reflect actual ownership structures? Could we find a transition approach that addresses your concerns without completely disrupting our existing client relationships? His suggestion revealed that he still didn't grasp the fundamental issue. This wasn't about gradually adjusting external positioning or finding transition approaches. This was about immediately complying with legal obligations that had been violated for 2 years and ensuring that future operations reflected actual ownership and authority structures. David, I replied, there's no gradual transition to legal compliance. Either we operate according to our partnership agreement or we don't. Either I'm recognized as a 45% owner with appropriate governance rights or I'm not. Either company decisions follow proper authorization procedures or they continue to violate our operating framework. The binary choice I'd presented eliminated the possibility of compromises that would allow them to continue operating primarily as they had while making cosmetic adjustments to address my concerns. We would either have genuine partnership governance, or we would need to explore alternative arrangements that could provide appropriate recognition of ownership stakes and decision-making authority. Jennifer, apparently recognizing that diplomatic solutions weren't going to resolve the fundamental conflicts, shifted toward a more direct approach. Emma, if the current management structure isn't acceptable to you and comprehensive restructuring would be too disruptive to our operations, what other options are we looking at? Are there alternative arrangements that might better serve everyone's interests? Her question opened the door to discussions about buyouts, partnership dissolution, or other structural changes that could resolve the governance conflicts without requiring the existing management team to operate under proper ownership oversight. It was a reasonable question that deserved serious consideration. Jennifer, I said, alternative arrangements are certainly possible, but they would need to appropriately value my ownership stake and contribution to company development. If the management team isn't prepared to operate under proper partnership governance, we should explore options that could provide fair compensation for my investment and role in creating the innovations that drive our revenue. The mention of fair compensation and appropriate valuation introduced financial considerations that would require comprehensive analysis of company assets, revenue streams, and growth potential. Any alternative arrangement would need to account for the substantial value I'd created through both initial investment and ongoing strategic contribution. Robert, who'd been largely silent during this exchange, finally spoke with obvious reluctance. Emma, before we start discussing buyouts or partnership dissolution, I want to make sure we've exhausted the possibilities for continuing to work together. Is there any scenario where you'd be comfortable maintaining the partnership under a restructured governance approach? His question suggested genuine interest in finding collaborative solutions, but it also revealed his concern about losing both my ownership investment and strategic contribution to company operations. The technical innovations and client relationships I'd developed represented substantial value that would be difficult to replace. Robert, I replied, I'm absolutely open to continuing the partnership under proper governance structures. But that would require genuine recognition of my ownership rights, immediate compliance with our operating agreement, and authentic commitment to partnership decision-making rather than autonomous management operations. The conversation had reached a crucial decision point. Either we would commit to restructuring company operations to reflect actual ownership and governance requirements, or we would need to explore alternative arrangements that could provide fair resolution of the conflicts that had developed over 2 years of operating outside our legal framework. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of the choices before us. The next few minutes would determine whether Meridian Tech would continue as a genuine partnership or evolve into something entirely different that could address the fundamental incompatibilities that had brought us to this confrontation. Looking around the table at faces that reflected various combinations of anxiety, calculation, and resignation, I realized that regardless of what happened next, the company picnic photos that had triggered this crisis had served their purpose. They'd forced recognition of problems that had been building for years and created the catalyst for changes that were long overdue. Sometimes the most important business decisions begin with the smallest slights that reveal much larger problems requiring comprehensive solutions. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Robert cleared his throat and attempted to regain control of the discussion. His face had taken on the pallor of someone calculating financial catastrophe, and I could see him running numbers in his head as he considered the implications of comprehensive governance restructuring or potential partnership dissolution. "Emma," he said carefully, "I think we need to step back and consider the practical realities of our situation. Meridian Tech has grown from a startup concept to a multi-million-dollar company with significant client obligations and employee responsibilities. Whatever governance adjustments we make need to account for the operational continuity that our stakeholders depend on." His attempt to frame this as a matter of operational continuity was revealing. Rather than addressing the fundamental violations of our partnership agreement, he was positioning proper governance as a threat to business stability. It was a classic deflection technique, but one that ignored the legal reality of our situation. "Robert," I replied, "the practical reality is that we've been operating outside our legal framework for 2 years, creating exactly the kind of instability you're now concerned about avoiding. Continuing to ignore governance requirements doesn't create operational continuity. It creates legal liability and business risk that grows larger every day we delay compliance." David shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. His corporate training had taught him to look for win-win solutions and collaborative compromises. But the binary nature of legal compliance didn't offer much room for the kind of diplomatic middle ground he preferred to negotiate. "Emma," David said, "I'm wondering if there might be a phased approach that could address your governance concerns while allowing us to maintain the operational relationships we've built with clients and industry partners. Perhaps we could implement proper consultation procedures while gradually adjusting external representations to reflect actual ownership structures." The suggestion revealed that he still didn't understand the fundamental issue we were confronting. This wasn't about gradually adjusting external representations or implementing consultation procedures as a courtesy. This was about immediately recognizing legal obligations that had been systematically violated and ensuring that future operations complied with established partnership agreements. "David," I responded, "there's no phased approach to legal compliance. Either decisions are properly authorized according to our operating agreement, or they're not. Either external representations accurately reflect company ownership and authority structures, or they constitute misrepresentation that could expose us to additional liability." Jennifer, who'd been taking notes throughout the discussion, looked up with the kind of calculated expression that suggested she was preparing to play what she considered her strongest card. Her background in corporate operations had taught her to identify leverage points and pressure strategies, and I could see her shifting into negotiation mode. "Emma," Jennifer said, "I think we all recognize that significant changes to our operational structure would require substantial coordination and might create disruption during the transition period. Have you considered how implementing immediate governance restructuring might affect our pending contract negotiations and upcoming investor presentations?" The question was designed to highlight the potential cost of demanding immediate compliance, suggesting that my insistence on proper governance could damage business relationships and financial opportunities. It was a sophisticated attempt to frame my legitimate concerns as unreasonable demands that would harm everyone's interests. "Jennifer," I replied, "I've considered how continuing to operate outside our legal framework might affect our pending contract negotiations and upcoming investor presentations. Potential clients and investors generally prefer to work with companies that operate according to their established governance structures, rather than businesses that systematically violate their own partnership agreements." Mark, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing confusion, finally spoke up with the kind of direct question that cut through the diplomatic maneuvering. "I'm sorry, but I'm still trying to understand something basic. If Emma owns 45% of the company and Robert owns 35%, doesn't that mean they control 80% of company decisions? Why are we discussing phased implementation of governance procedures when the partnership agreement apparently already defines how decisions should be made?" His question highlighted the absurdity of treating established legal obligations as negotiable preferences. The operating procedures weren't suggestions that could be implemented gradually, based on operational convenience. They were binding requirements that defined how our company was supposed to function. "Mark," I said, "you're absolutely correct. The partnership agreement defines decision-making procedures that should have been followed from the beginning. The fact that they haven't been followed doesn't make them optional. It makes the past 2 years a period of governance violations that need to be addressed." Robert, apparently recognizing that diplomatic deflection wasn't working, shifted toward a more direct acknowledgement of the problems, while still attempting to minimize their significance. Emma, I accept that we haven't been following proper governance procedures, and I'm committed to ensuring that changes immediately. But I'm concerned about how comprehensive restructuring might affect the momentum we've built with current clients and the industry reputation we've established. The concern about momentum and industry reputation was interesting because it revealed how much their professional identities had become invested in maintaining the fictional hierarchy they'd created. They'd built their external credibility on presenting themselves as autonomous decision-makers, when they were actually employees who'd been operating without proper oversight. Robert, I said, the industry reputation you're concerned about protecting is based on misrepresenting our company's ownership and authority structures. If that reputation can't withstand accurate representation of who actually makes decisions in this company, then it's not a reputation worth protecting. David attempted to introduce a new angle to the discussion, apparently hoping to find some basis for compromise that would allow them to maintain their preferred operational approach. Emma, what if we restructured our external communications to accurately reflect ownership stakes while maintaining our current operational efficiency? Could we find a way to acknowledge your partnership role without completely changing our day-to-day management procedures? His suggestion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what partnership governance actually required. This wasn't about external communications or acknowledgement of my partnership role. This was about actual decision-making authority and operational control that extended far beyond how we presented ourselves to outside parties. David, I replied, partnership governance isn't about external communications or acknowledgement. It's about actual authority over company decisions and strategic direction. You can't maintain operational efficiency that depends on ignoring the legal structure that governs this company. Jennifer, apparently recognizing that her initial negotiation strategy wasn't succeeding, shifted toward a more confrontational approach that revealed her growing frustration with the constraints that proper governance would impose on her preferred management style. Emma, Jennifer said, I think we need to be honest about what you're really requesting. You're asking us to restructure successful operations that have generated significant revenue growth and client satisfaction in order to accommodate governance procedures that would slow decision-making and complicate management coordination. Is that really in the best interest of company performance? The framing was revealing because it positioned proper governance as an accommodation rather than a legal obligation, and suggested that violating our partnership agreement had been justified by business performance. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had created this crisis in the first place. Jennifer, I responded, I'm not requesting anything. I'm demanding compliance with the legal obligations that have governed this company since its founding. The fact that you've achieved revenue growth and client satisfaction while violating those obligations doesn't justify continuing to operate outside our established framework. Mark, who'd been processing the implications of everything he'd heard, raised a question that cut to the heart of the practical challenges we were facing. If we implement proper governance procedures immediately, what does that mean for decisions that have already been made? Are there contracts or operational commitments that might need to be reviewed or potentially modified? His question opened up one of the most complex aspects of bringing our operations into compliance with proper governance. 2 years of unauthorized decisions had created obligations and relationships that might not be legally binding if they hadn't been properly approved according to our partnership agreement. Mark, I said, that's exactly why we need to involve our attorney in reviewing the current situation. Contracts, operational commitments, and strategic arrangements that were made without proper partner approval might need legal review to determine their validity and ensure that any necessary corrections are made. The mention of legal review and potential contract modifications sent a visible shock through the room. David began frantically calculating which client relationships might be affected by governance compliance requirements. Jennifer's confrontational approach quickly shifted back toward damage control as she considered the implications of invalidated operational decisions. Robert looked like someone who was beginning to understand the true scope of the crisis they'd created through 2 years of governance violations. Emma, Robert said, his voice reflecting genuine alarm. Are you suggesting that our existing client contracts might not be legally valid? Because if that's the case, we could be looking at much more serious problems than operational restructuring. The fear in his voice was understandable. If major client contracts required partner approval that hadn't been obtained, we could be facing breach of contract claims, client relationship disasters, and financial liability that extended far beyond the governance issues that had triggered this discussion. Robert, I replied, I'm suggesting that any contracts or commitments made without following proper authorization procedures need legal review to determine their status and ensure compliance with our operating agreement. Whether that creates additional problems depends on how extensively management has been operating outside established governance frameworks. David, who'd been responsible for most of the client relationship management, looked increasingly panicked as he considered the implications for deals he'd negotiated and implemented without any reference to partnership approval requirements. Emma, if we need to review existing contracts for proper authorization, that could affect our relationships with Morrison Industries, TechFlow Systems, and basically every major client we've acquired over the past 18 months. His admission revealed the scope of unauthorized decision-making that had been happening while I'd been excluded from governance participation. Major client relationships representing millions of dollars in revenue had been established through processes that violated our partnership agreement and might require comprehensive review. David, I said, then we need to review those relationships and ensure they're properly authorized according to our operating procedures. The alternative is continuing to operate outside our legal framework and hoping that governance violations don't create additional liability. Jennifer, apparently recognizing that the discussion had moved far beyond operational adjustments into potential legal crisis territory, made one final attempt to find a solution that would avoid comprehensive review of past decisions. Emma, Jennifer said, what if we commit to proper governance moving forward and establish procedures to retroactively approve major decisions that were made without appropriate consultation? Could we find a way to bring operations into compliance without disrupting existing client relationships? Her suggestion of retroactive approval was interesting because it acknowledged the violation of governance procedures while attempting to minimize the consequences through after-the-fact authorization. It was a reasonable approach that could potentially resolve compliance issues without creating unnecessary disruption to business operations. Jennifer, I replied, retroactive approval could be part of a comprehensive compliance solution, but it would need to include genuine review of past decisions and commitment to proper authorization procedures for all future operations. We can't just rubber stamp previous violations and continue operating as we have been. Mark, who'd been quietly processing the implications of retroactive approval requirements, raised another practical question that highlighted the complexity of bringing operations into compliance. If we're reviewing major decisions for retroactive approval, how do we determine which decisions require partner consultation and which fall under normal management authority? His question pointed to one of the fundamental problems that had created this crisis. The management team had been operating without any clear understanding of which decisions required partner approval, leading to systematic violations of governance procedures across multiple areas of company operations. Mark, I said, that's exactly why we need to review our operating agreement and establish clear procedures for different types of decisions. The partnership documents define authorization requirements, but they've never been implemented in day-to-day operations. Robert, who'd been growing increasingly agitated as the scope of required changes became apparent, finally expressed the frustration that had been building throughout the discussion. Emma, I understand that we need to address governance compliance, but I'm concerned that the process you're describing could consume months of management attention and potentially damage client relationships that have taken years to build. His concern about management attention and client relationships was revealing because it suggested he was still thinking about proper governance as a burden to be managed rather than a fundamental requirement for legitimate business operations. The time and attention required for compliance wasn't optional overhead that could be minimized based on convenience. Robert, I replied, the time and attention required for governance compliance is the cost of operating a legitimate partnership business. If you're not prepared to invest that time and attention, then we need to discuss alternative arrangements that could resolve our conflicts without requiring comprehensive operational restructuring. The mention of alternative arrangements brought us back to the fundamental choice we'd been circling throughout the discussion. Either we would commit to operating as a genuine partnership with proper governance procedures, or we would need to explore structural changes that could address the incompatibilities that had become apparent over 2 years of governance violations. David, apparently recognizing that the discussion had reached a crucial decision point, made one final attempt to find middle ground that could preserve the operational approach they preferred while addressing my governance concerns. Emma, David said, what if we establish a timeline for implementing proper governance procedures while continuing current operations under a transitional framework? Could we create a structured approach that addresses compliance requirements without immediate disruption to business operations? His suggestion of a transitional framework was appealing in theory, but it still reflected the assumption that proper governance was something to be implemented gradually, rather than an immediate legal obligation that required immediate compliance. The transitional approach would essentially authorize continued violations, while creating the appearance of movement toward compliance. David, I responded, there's no transitional framework for legal compliance. Either we operate according to our partnership agreement immediately, or we continue violating our governance obligations while pretending that gradual implementation constitutes proper business practice. Jennifer, apparently recognizing that diplomatic solutions weren't going to resolve the fundamental conflicts we were facing, shifted toward the kind of direct confrontation that revealed her true position on partnership governance. Emma, Jennifer said, I think we need to be realistic about what you're demanding. You're asking us to restructure successful operations, review millions of dollars in client contracts, and implement governance procedures that could significantly complicate our competitive positioning. If those requirements aren't negotiable, then maybe we need to discuss whether this partnership arrangement is still viable for any of us. Her statement was significant because it acknowledged that the management team wasn't prepared to operate under proper partnership governance and was willing to consider dissolving the business relationship rather than comply with established legal obligations. It was a direct challenge that required an equally direct response. Jennifer, I said, I'm not asking you to restructure anything. I'm demanding that you operate according to the legal framework that has governed this company since its founding. If you're not prepared to do that, then you're absolutely right that we need to discuss whether this partnership arrangement is viable. The room fell into tense silence as everyone processed the implications of what had just been acknowledged. We'd moved beyond discussions of operational adjustments and compliance timelines into direct consideration of partnership dissolution as the most realistic solution to conflicts that couldn't be resolved through compromise or gradual implementation. Robert, who'd been listening to this exchange with obvious dismay, made one final attempt to prevent the complete breakdown of our business relationship. Emma, before we start discussing partnership dissolution, I want to make sure we understand all the implications. Are there any scenarios where you'd be willing to continue working together? Or have we reached the point where separation is the only realistic option? His question was crucial because it would determine whether we spent our remaining time together trying to find collaborative solutions or focused on negotiating the terms of business separation. The answer would shape everything that happened next in our professional relationship. Looking around the table at faces that reflected various combinations of anxiety, defiance, and resignation, I realized that the company picnic photos that had started this crisis had revealed problems that extended far beyond governance violations into fundamental incompatibilities about authority, respect, and professional relationships that couldn't be resolved through procedural adjustments or diplomatic compromise. I took a deep breath and considered Robert's question carefully. The weight of the decision before us would determine not just the future of Meridian Tech, but the trajectory of everyone's career in the room. 2 years of systematic exclusion had brought us to this crossroads, and the path forward would require courage from all parties involved. Robert, I said finally, there are scenarios where I'd be willing to continue our partnership, but they require genuine commitment to operating as equals rather than as a management hierarchy with token consultation. If this team is prepared to embrace authentic partnership governance, we can find a path forward. If not, separation might be the most honest solution for everyone involved. The distinction was crucial because it moved us beyond procedural compliance into fundamental questions about respect, authority, and professional relationships. Partnership governance wasn't just about following authorization procedures. It was about recognizing that decision-making authority derived from ownership stakes rather than management positions or corporate titles. David leaned forward, his expression suggesting he was finally beginning to grasp the scope of change that would be required. Emma, when you talk about authentic partnership governance, what does that look like practically? How would daily operations change if we implemented proper procedures? His question revealed that despite 2 years of working together, the management team had never understood the basic mechanics of partnership decision-making, or how ownership stakes translated into operational authority. They'd been functioning as autonomous managers in a company where major decisions legally required partner consultation. David, I replied, authentic partnership governance means that strategic decisions, significant contracts, organizational changes, and external representations require consultation between Robert and me as the controlling ownership stakeholders. Management decisions within established parameters can be made independently, but the parameters themselves need to be established through proper partner consultation. Jennifer, who'd been taking notes throughout our discussion, looked up with the kind of calculation that suggested she was trying to determine whether partnership governance would be compatible with her preferred management style. Her corporate background had taught her to function within hierarchical structures where authority flowed from position rather than ownership. Emma, Jennifer said, I'm trying to understand how partner consultation would work in practice. If Robert and you need to approve strategic decisions, does that mean all management recommendations need partnership review before implementation? Because that could significantly complicate our response times and competitive positioning. Her concern about response times and competitive positioning reflected the underlying assumption that proper governance would be inefficient compared to the autonomous decision-making they'd been practicing. It was a reasonable concern that needed to be addressed directly. Jennifer, I responded, partnership consultation doesn't mean that every management recommendation requires lengthy review processes. It means that decisions beyond normal management authority need appropriate approval before implementation. The key is establishing clear boundaries between management decisions and partnership decisions so everyone understands when consultation is required. Mark, who'd been quietly processing the implications of partnership governance, raised a question that highlighted one of the practical challenges we'd need to address. If we establish clear boundaries between management and partnership decisions, how do we handle situations where market conditions require quick responses that might normally require partner consultation? His question was sophisticated because it recognized that business operations sometimes required rapid decision-making that might not accommodate lengthy consultation processes. Any workable governance structure would need to account for legitimate operational requirements while maintaining proper authorization procedures. Mark, I said, emergency situations and time-sensitive opportunities can be handled through pre-authorized parameters and expedited consultation procedures. The operating agreement includes provisions for situations where normal consultation timelines aren't practical, but those provisions require advanced planning rather than after-the-fact justification. Robert, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of what partnership governance would actually require, finally spoke with what sounded like genuine commitment to finding collaborative solutions. Emma, Robert said, I think I'm beginning to understand why the past 2 years have been frustrating for you and why proper governance is essential for our continued partnership. I'm committed to implementing authentic consultation procedures and ensuring that future decisions reflect actual ownership authority rather than assumed management hierarchy. His acknowledgement was significant because it represented the first genuine recognition from company leadership that the problems we'd been discussing were serious violations of partnership obligations rather than minor procedural oversights that could be addressed through improved communication. Robert, I replied, I appreciate your commitment to implementing proper procedures, but words need to be followed by consistent actions. Partnership governance requires ongoing commitment to consultation and shared decision-making, rather than occasional acknowledgement of ownership stakes when convenient. David, apparently recognizing that the discussion had moved toward potential collaboration rather than inevitable separation, shifted his approach toward practical implementation of the changes that would be required. Emma, David said, if we commit to proper partnership governance moving forward, what's the timeline for reviewing past decisions and bringing our operations into full compliance? And what kind of support would you need from the management team to make the transition successful? His questions suggested genuine interest in making partnership governance work, rather than finding excuses to avoid the responsibilities it would entail. The shift from defensive justification to collaborative problem-solving represented a significant change in the dynamic that had characterized our discussion. David, I responded, the timeline for compliance review depends on how extensively past decisions need partner approval, and how quickly we can establish proper procedures for future operations. I'd estimate 90 days for comprehensive review and implementation, assuming full cooperation from the management team. Jennifer, who'd been calculating the implications of partnership governance for her own role in company operations, raised a concern that revealed how much the proposed changes would affect her preferred management approach. Emma, Jennifer said, if partnership consultation becomes standard procedure for strategic decisions, how do we maintain the operational efficiency that our clients expect? Some of our competitive advantages come from rapid decision-making and quick implementation of client solutions. Her concern about operational efficiency was legitimate, but it also reflected the assumption that proper governance would necessarily slow operations rather than providing better strategic direction and more sustainable decision-making processes. Jennifer, I replied, operational efficiency that depends on violating governance procedures isn't sustainable competitive advantage. It's business risk that grows larger over time. Proper partnership consultation can actually improve decision quality and strategic coordination while ensuring that operations are legally compliant. Mark, who'd been considering the implications of partnership governance for his own role in business development, asked a question that highlighted the broader organizational changes that would be required. Emma, Mark said, if we implement proper partnership governance, how does that affect external representations and client communications? Do we need to restructure how we present company leadership and decision-making authority to outside parties? His question was crucial because it addressed one of the most visible aspects of the changes that would be required. 2 years of misrepresenting company authority structures had created external relationships based on fictional hierarchy that would need to be corrected. Mark, I said, external representations need to accurately reflect actual ownership and authority structures rather than presenting fictional management hierarchy. That doesn't mean we need to complicate client communications, but it does mean we need to stop misrepresenting who makes decisions in this company. Robert, who'd been processing the scope of changes that proper governance would require, made what sounded like a genuine commitment to the partnership restructuring we'd been discussing. Emma, Robert said, I want to move forward with implementing authentic partnership governance and bringing our operations into compliance with our operating agreement. The management team has my full support for whatever changes are necessary to operate according to proper procedures. His statement was significant because it represented clear leadership commitment to partnership governance rather than continued autonomous management operations. The backing from company leadership would be essential for successful implementation of the changes we'd been discussing. Robert, I replied, I'm encouraged by your commitment to proper governance, and I'm willing to work with the management team to implement the necessary changes. But success will require consistent follow-through, rather than initial enthusiasm that fades when implementation becomes challenging. David, apparently energized by the possibility of collaborative solutions rather than partnership dissolution, began outlining practical steps for implementing the governance changes we'd been discussing. Emma, David said, what if we establish weekly partnership consultation meetings to review strategic decisions and ensure proper authorization procedures? Could we create a structured approach that addresses governance requirements while maintaining operational momentum? His suggestion of weekly consultation meetings was a reasonable starting point for implementing proper partnership procedures, though the specific structure would need to be refined based on actual business requirements and decision-making patterns. David, I responded, weekly consultation meetings could be part of a comprehensive governance structure, but we'd need to supplement regular meetings with expedited procedures for time-sensitive decisions and clear authority boundaries for different types of operational choices. Jennifer, who'd been considering how partnership governance would affect her role in client relationships and operational coordination, raised a practical question about implementation logistics. Emma, Jennifer said, if we implement partnership consultation procedures, do we need to inform existing clients about governance changes, or can we transition to proper procedures without disrupting current business relationships? Her question highlighted the diplomatic challenges of correcting 2 years of misrepresentation without creating unnecessary confusion or concern among clients who'd been working under the assumption that management had full decision-making authority. Jennifer, I said, we don't need to create unnecessary confusion for existing clients, but we do need to ensure that future communications accurately represent authority structures and that any major contract modifications follow proper authorization procedures. Mark, who'd been thinking about the implications for business development and new client relationships, asked about external positioning that would reflect the governance changes we were implementing. Emma, Mark said, for new client relationships and industry positioning, how do we present the partnership structure in a way that demonstrates strong leadership while accurately reflecting decision-making authority? His question was sophisticated because it recognized that proper governance representation could actually strengthen external relationships by demonstrating stable ownership structure and clear authority, rather than the ambiguous management hierarchy that had characterized our previous positioning. Mark, I replied, authentic partnership representation can strengthen external relationships by demonstrating stable ownership commitment and clear decision-making processes rather than ambiguous management authority that might leave clients uncertain about who they're actually working with. Robert, apparently convinced that partnership governance could work successfully with proper implementation, made a direct proposal for moving forward with the comprehensive changes we'd been discussing. Emma, Robert said, I propose that we commit to 90-day implementation of proper partnership governance, including review of past decisions for retroactive approval where necessary, and establishment of ongoing consultation procedures for all future strategic decisions. Are you willing to move forward on that basis? His proposal represented a significant commitment to the fundamental changes that would be required for authentic partnership operations, rather than continued autonomous management with token consultation when convenient. Robert, I said, I'm willing to commit to 90-day implementation assuming genuine cooperation from the entire management team and binding agreements about ongoing partnership procedures, rather than temporary adjustments that could be abandoned when convenient. The discussion had reached a crucial resolution point. Rather than partnership dissolution or continued governance violations, we'd found a path toward authentic collaboration that could address the systematic exclusion that had brought us to this crisis, while maintaining the business relationships and operational momentum that everyone valued. David, apparently relieved that we'd found collaborative solutions rather than adversarial separation, outlined next steps for beginning the implementation process immediately. Emma, David said, what if we scheduled partnership consultation meetings twice weekly for the first month to address the backlog of decisions that need retroactive approval, while establishing proper procedures for ongoing operations? His suggestion of accelerated consultation during the transition period was practical because it would allow us to address compliance issues quickly while establishing sustainable procedures for normal operations. David, I responded, twice-weekly meetings during the transition period make sense, and we should also establish emergency consultation procedures for urgent decisions that can't wait for scheduled meetings. Jennifer, who'd initially been resistant to partnership governance requirements, seemed to have accepted the necessity of implementing proper procedures and was shifting toward collaborative problem-solving. Emma, Jennifer said, I'm committed to supporting the partnership governance implementation and ensuring that all management decisions follow proper authorization procedures. What kind of documentation do you need to track compliance during the transition period? Her question about compliance documentation suggested genuine commitment to making the new procedures work rather than finding ways to circumvent governance requirements when they became inconvenient. Jennifer, I said, we'll need decision logs that track which choices require partnership consultation and verification that proper approval has been obtained before implementation. The documentation will help establish patterns and refine procedures as we gain experience with the new governance structure. Mark, who'd been considering the broader implications of partnership governance for company culture and employee relationships, raised a question about internal communications regarding the organizational changes. Emma, Mark said, how do we communicate the governance changes to other company employees without creating confusion about management authority or concern about organizational stability? His question was thoughtful because it recognized that implementing partnership governance would require internal coordination beyond just the management team, and that employee understanding would be crucial for successful implementation. Mark, I replied, we can communicate the changes as implementation of proper partnership procedures that will strengthen decision-making and ensure sustainable operations rather than presenting them as corrections to previous problems. The conversation had evolved from confrontation about governance violations into collaborative planning for authentic partnership operations. The systematic exclusion that had triggered this crisis was being addressed through comprehensive structural changes that would prevent similar problems in the future. Robert, apparently energized by the collaborative direction our discussion had taken, made a final commitment that captured the spirit of what we'd accomplished. "Emma," Robert said, "I want to thank you for having the courage to demand proper partnership governance rather than accepting the exclusion that had become our normal practice. The changes we're implementing will make Meridian Tech a stronger company with more sustainable operations." His acknowledgement was particularly meaningful because it recognized that my insistence on proper governance had been necessary for the health of our business relationship, rather than an unreasonable demand that complicated otherwise successful operations. "Robert," I replied, "authentic partnership governance benefits everyone involved by ensuring that decisions are made with proper authority and that all stakeholders are appropriately recognized for their contributions to company success." 6 months later, Meridian Tech had been transformed into a genuine partnership with proper governance procedures, authentic external representation, and collaborative decision-making that reflected actual ownership structures rather than fictional management hierarchy. The company picnic photos from that spring showed a leadership team that accurately represented our authority relationships and included everyone who actually made strategic decisions for company operations. The client relationships that had been built on misrepresentation had been strengthened through accurate positioning that demonstrated stable ownership commitment and clear decision-making processes. Industry recognition had increased as our authentic partnership structure provided credibility that fictional management hierarchy had never achieved. Most importantly, the workplace culture had evolved to value contribution and expertise rather than position and exclusion. The systematic marginalization that had characterized my experience for 2 years had been replaced by collaborative partnership that recognized all stakeholders appropriately. The transformation hadn't been easy, and there had been moments during implementation when the management team struggled with sharing authority they'd assumed was exclusively theirs. But the results spoke for themselves. Meridian Tech had become more successful, more sustainable, and more authentic in its operations. Looking back on the company picnic photos that had triggered this entire transformation, I realized they'd served a crucial purpose by forcing recognition of problems that had been building for years and creating the catalyst for changes that were long overdue. Sometimes the most important business decisions begin with the smallest slights that reveal much larger problems requiring comprehensive solutions. The silent partner, who'd been systematically excluded from leadership recognition, had become an acknowledged owner with proper authority over company operations. The lesson was clear: authentic success requires authentic representation, and sustainable partnerships demand genuine respect for all stakeholders involved. 3 months into our partnership governance implementation, an unexpected opportunity arrived that would test everything we'd established. Secure Global, one of the largest cybersecurity firms in North America, had been quietly observing our innovative security protocols and rapid client growth. Their CEO, Marcus Thompson, requested a meeting to discuss what he termed strategic partnership possibilities. But Patricia Wong's preliminary research suggested they were actually interested in acquisition. The timing was both perfect and challenging. Perfect because our properly functioning partnership governance had strengthened our operations and market position significantly. Challenging because an acquisition discussion would require the kind of unified decision-making that our previous dysfunction would have made impossible. Robert called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice carrying excitement tempered by careful caution. "Emma, I've had an initial conversation with Marcus Thompson from Secure Global. They're interested in discussing acquisition terms that could be very attractive for both of us. But before I respond to their formal meeting request, I wanted to ensure we approach this as genuine partners." His instinct to consult before responding represented exactly the kind of partnership behavior that had been missing for our first 2 years. The old Robert would have scheduled preliminary meetings and begun negotiations before mentioning the opportunity to me, treating my ownership stake as something to be informed about rather than consulted on. "Robert," I replied, "I appreciate you reaching out before moving forward. What kind of preliminary information do we have about their interest and potential terms?" Marcus was careful not to commit to specific numbers during our initial conversation, but he mentioned that TechSecure has been tracking our Morrison Industries implementation and the breakthrough protocols you developed for their distributed network security. He seemed particularly impressed by our client retention rates and the scalability of our technical solutions. The fact that Marcus had specifically mentioned my technical innovations was encouraging, suggesting that TechSecure understood the value creation that had driven Meridian Tech's success, rather than just looking at revenue numbers and client lists. Robert, I said, if we're going to explore acquisition possibilities, we need to ensure that any discussions accurately represent our partnership structure and that both of us are involved in negotiations from the beginning. No more misrepresentation of company authority. Absolutely, Robert agreed. I was thinking we should schedule the initial meeting together and make it clear that any serious discussions need to involve both partners. Marcus should understand that we operate as a genuine partnership rather than a traditional CEO-led hierarchy. Our first meeting with TechSecure was scheduled for the following Thursday at their downtown Denver offices, an impressive building that suggested both financial strength and technological sophistication. Marcus Thompson met us in the lobby personally, a gesture that immediately established the seriousness of their interest in acquisition discussions. Robert, Emma, Marcus said as he shook our hands, thank you for making time to explore this opportunity. TechSecure has been impressed by Meridian Tech's innovative approach and rapid market penetration. We're always interested in partnerships that could benefit both organizations. His careful use of the word partnerships rather than acquisitions was diplomatic, but the context made his intentions clear. As we rode the elevator to the executive conference room, I could see him evaluating our dynamic as partners, clearly trying to understand our decision-making structure and authority relationships. The conference room overlooked downtown Denver's skyline, with views that stretched toward the mountains beyond the city. Marcus had arranged for his Chief Technology Officer, Sarah Chen, and Chief Financial Officer, Michael Rodriguez, to join our discussion, suggesting they were serious about moving quickly if initial conversations went well. Before we discussed specific opportunities, Marcus began once we were seated. I'd like to understand Meridian Tech's ownership structure and decision-making processes. Our preliminary research indicated some uncertainty about company governance that we'd want to clarify before moving forward. His question was direct but tactful, acknowledging that their research had probably uncovered the governance issues we'd been addressing, while giving us an opportunity to explain our current structure without dwelling on past problems. Marcus, I replied, Meridian Tech operates as a genuine partnership between Robert and myself. I hold 45% ownership. Robert holds 35%, and the remaining 20% is distributed among early employees through equity arrangements. Major strategic decisions require consultation between Robert and me as the controlling partners. Sarah Chen, the CTO, leaned forward with obvious interest. Emma, our technical team has been studying your distributed security protocols, particularly the implementation at Morrison Industries. The innovation in real-time threat assessment and automated response coordination is impressive. Did you develop those systems independently or through collaborative process? Her question revealed that TechSecure had done substantial technical due diligence and understood the value of the innovations that had driven our growth. It also gave me an opportunity to establish my role in company development, rather than having my contributions minimized or misrepresented. Sarah, I said, I developed the foundational protocols during graduate work in cybersecurity, then refined and scaled them specifically for enterprise applications after we founded Meridian Tech. The Morrison Industries implementation was the first full deployment of the integrated system. Michael Rodriguez, the CFO, pulled out a tablet and began reviewing what appeared to be detailed financial analysis. According to our research, Meridian Tech has achieved exceptional revenue growth and client retention over the past 2 years. What would you attribute that success to, and how sustainable do you consider your current growth trajectory? His question was crucial because it would determine whether TechSecure viewed our success as sustainable competitive advantage or temporary market opportunity that might not justify significant acquisition investment. Michael, Robert replied, our growth has been driven by technical innovation combined with strategic client relationship management. Emma's security protocols provide genuine competitive advantages, and our partnership governance ensures that strategic decisions reflect both technical expertise and market understanding. Marcus nodded approvingly at Robert's reference to partnership governance, apparently recognizing that our collaborative decision-making structure could be valuable for post-acquisition integration rather than a complication to be managed. Robert, Emma, Marcus said, TechSecure is interested in acquisition opportunities that would bring innovative technology and talented teams into our organization while maintaining the entrepreneurial culture that drives innovation. What would acquisition terms need to include for you to consider this opportunity seriously? His question moved us into substantive negotiation territory, requiring the kind of unified response that our previous governance dysfunction would have made impossible. Robert and I exchanged glances, a silent communication that reflected months of partnership collaboration. Marcus, I said, any acquisition terms would need to appropriately value both our technical innovations and our growth potential, include employment arrangements that recognize our respective expertise, and provide sufficient autonomy for continued innovation within TechSecure's broader structure. Sarah Chen smiled approvingly. Emma, those requirements align well with TechSecure's acquisition philosophy. We found that innovative teams perform best when they maintain operational independence while gaining access to broader resources and market opportunities. Michael Rodriguez began outlining preliminary valuation approaches based on our revenue growth, client retention, technical innovation, and market potential. The numbers he discussed were substantially higher than I'd expected, reflecting TechSecure's genuine interest in acquiring our capabilities rather than just our client relationships. Based on our preliminary analysis, Michael said, we'd be looking at acquisition terms in the range of $12 to $15 million, depending on final due diligence and employment arrangements. Does that range seem reasonable for opening formal negotiations? The numbers were staggering. My 45% stake would be worth between $5 and $7 million, providing financial security that would allow me to pursue any professional opportunities I chose, while rewarding the investment and innovation that had built Meridian Tech's value. Michael, Robert said, those numbers are certainly attractive, but we'd want to understand the employment terms and operational integration before making any commitments. What does TechSecure typically expect from acquired leadership teams? Marcus leaned back in his chair, apparently pleased that we were engaging seriously with their proposal rather than dismissing it or demanding unrealistic terms. Robert, our approach is to maintain successful teams in leadership roles within their technical specializations, while providing broader resources for scaling innovations and expanding market reach. The conversation continued for another hour, covering integration timelines, employment structures, operational autonomy, and client relationship management. By the end of the meeting, both organizations had expressed serious interest in moving forward with formal due diligence and structured negotiations. Marcus, I said as we prepared to leave, TechSecure's approach seems compatible with our interests and values. We're willing to move forward with formal discussions, assuming we can structure arrangements that work for everyone involved. Driving back to our office, Robert and I began processing the implications of what we'd just experienced. The acquisition opportunity represented validation of everything we'd built together and offered financial rewards that exceeded our original expectations when we'd started Meridian Tech. Emma, Robert said, I know this is moving quickly, but I wanted to get your honest assessment of TechSecure as potential partners. Do you think we could maintain our innovation culture within their organizational structure? His question revealed genuine concern about preserving the collaborative environment we'd created, rather than just maximizing financial returns from acquisition. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that our partnership governance had been designed to facilitate. Robert, I replied, Marcus and his team seem to understand that our value comes from innovation and collaboration, rather than just our current client base. If they're genuinely committed to maintaining operational autonomy, this could be an excellent opportunity for both personal and professional growth. The formal due diligence process took 6 weeks, during which TechSecure's technical and financial teams conducted comprehensive review of our operations, innovations, client relationships, and growth potential. The process revealed how much our partnership governance improvements had strengthened our position as an acquisition target. Emma, Patricia Wong told me during one of our regular legal consultations, TechSecure's due diligence team has been impressed by your governance documentation and partnership procedures. They've specifically mentioned that your collaborative decision-making structure demonstrates operational maturity that many startups lack. The irony wasn't lost on me that the governance crisis that had nearly destroyed our partnership 6 months earlier was now being cited as evidence of our organizational strength. Sometimes the most difficult changes produce the most valuable long-term benefits. The final acquisition terms exceeded even our optimistic expectations. TechSecure offered $18 million for complete ownership, with employment contracts that guaranteed Robert and me significant autonomy within our technical specializations, plus equity participation in TechSecure's continued growth. Emma, Marcus said during our final negotiation session, TechSecure wants to ensure that the innovation culture that built Meridian Tech continues to thrive within our broader organization. Your partnership governance model has actually influenced our thinking about collaborative leadership structures. My 45% stake in the final acquisition was worth over $8 million, but more importantly, the process had validated the partnership governance principles we'd fought to establish. Our insistence on authentic collaboration and proper recognition had created value that extended far beyond financial returns. The closing dinner was held at Denver's most exclusive restaurant, with views of the city lights and mountain silhouettes that provided a fitting backdrop for celebrating the culmination of our entrepreneurial journey. Robert raised his glass in a toast that captured the significance of what we'd accomplished. "Emma," Robert said, "6 months ago our partnership was in crisis because we hadn't learned to operate as genuine equals. Tonight we're celebrating not just financial success, but the collaborative relationship that made this success possible. The acquisition transformed my life in ways that extended far beyond financial security. The technical innovations I developed became part of TechSecure's global cybersecurity platform, protecting millions of users across multiple continents. The partnership governance principles we'd established influenced organizational development throughout TechSecure's operational divisions. Most importantly, the experience had taught me that demanding respect and authentic recognition isn't about ego or control. It's about creating the conditions where innovation and collaboration can flourish, rather than being stifled by hierarchy and exclusion." Looking back on the company picnic photos that had triggered our governance crisis, I realized they'd served a purpose I hadn't anticipated at the time. They'd forced recognition of problems that needed to be addressed, and created the catalyst for changes that ultimately enhanced our value as both partners and professionals. The silent partner who'd been excluded from leadership photos had become a recognized innovator, whose contributions were valued by industry leaders. The lesson was clear: authentic success requires authentic representation, and sustainable partnerships demand genuine respect for all stakeholders involved. Sometimes the most powerful response to exclusion isn't confrontation or revenge, but simply insisting on the recognition you've already earned, and creating the collaborative relationships that allow everyone's contributions to be valued appropriately. The financial rewards were significant, but the professional satisfaction of being genuinely valued was worth even more. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.